Hello, everybody, and welcome to Tea with Halo. And we are coming back to our second installment of the conversation with Sara Mastros here. I am your host, Halo Quinn. If you missed the first part of this, then it came out last week, and we were having such a good conversation that we decided that we were going to continue. So for you, it's been a week. For us, it's been, well, it actually ended up being 15 minutes because we started chatting before I hit record. So last time we talked about magicians and strategy and how to actually start to plan your magic, the importance of keeping notes for when it goes horribly wrong or when it goes horribly right and you want to repeat it.
That's right.
Right. Books versus video and like the way that how we get our information that changes how we think about magical information, what we value, all of those pieces. And Sara shared a wonderful method of a process for actually planning out magical operations. Like, what are you going to do when you've got a thing that you want to conjure for or enchant for? And then I stopped taking notes on what we were talking about because I got too into it. It was about weirdness and woo and allies and materia not just being material and about re-enchanting the world. At which point we decided we needed more tea. And Sara set a piece of homework for you. So hopefully, if you caught it, you'll have had a think about it and you'll have commented in the previous video. But if you haven't, then take a moment to think about this now and share. Go for it, Sara.
So the homework was to think about like when you were a kid, think about like a story, or it could have been like a movie, or just something that you saw and you were like, oh, that's like real magic, the magic I want. Like I want it to be like that. Like, and what story was it? Like, what piece of fiction was it? Or maybe it wasn't fiction, but like wherever you first encountered and you were like, oh, that's the good stuff. Like magic is real, right? And I'm going to come back in a little bit and remind me, Halo, I'll talk about mine because I have a couple different ones, right? But we were talking, while the camera was off and we were both like fixing our tea, we had a little conversation about the nature of fairy tales, particularly as an American, right? So right now I'm talking sort of specifically to Americans and also and anyone else who like grew up in a culture that is foreign to the land they grew up in. Because, I met Halo. Well, I actually met Halo once in, I think, England, in
In
Birmingham,
Wales.
in
In
Wales,
Wales.
in
Welsh
Wales,
school.
right? Near where Halo lives, right?
Yeah.
But like we really got to know each other actually while we were both visiting Italy,
Yes.
right? In a different retreat. But, as an American, the stories we grow up with that are set in like, fairy tale land or like Narnia or like Middle Earth. My younger brother lives in England, actually in the town where Haley grew up, right? That's where my brother lives now. So I visit England pretty regularly, and I'm never so aware of, as we Americans would say, the fact that I live on stolen land. Because American, it is not obvious, especially as a kid, that like Narnia or Middle Earth, that those are like a very thin fantasy gloss on top of rural England because they are not a gloss on top of the forest I grew up in. Like my forest is not that forest, right? Like the war between the Oak King and the Holly King, that is not what is going on in my forest, right? Like in my forest, like the white pine queen is an evergreen queen. Like she rules all year round. And not that we don't have holly and oak trees, but those are not like that's not the predominant story of my forest. And I don't know, that's what we were talking about is the idea of like fairy tale land in like I'm gonna be a little political, like a proper culture. That is to say, a culture where like the culture matches the land, matches the language, and they've all like evolved together over centuries, matches the people and the ancestors. That's very different than
Mm-hmm.
working magic as an American, where like, my family's been in this country for on different branches, but around 100 years. So all of my grandparents were born in the United States. most of my great grandparents were not, like on all the various branches, right? And you know, and they all maintained, because my mom's family's Jewish, my dad's family's Greek. They maintained quite like a close connection to that culture in a way that like many white Christian Americans do not have an ancestral culture that they actually participate in. And I just think about that a lot and think about it like in terms of magic, right? So I'm not really exactly sure where this conversation is going exactly. But I really wanted to highlight that, like, as I grow up as a magician, one of the, I'm going to say, pitfalls of like learning fairy tale magic as an American is that that is a deeply foreign magic, right? And like the plants and animals it is talking about as people, like, it's easy to think of those as fantastical, but they're not. They're just European, right? But it's really important to like get to know your own land. And especially where I live, like in the Northeast, like those cultures are hard to come. Where I live in Pennsylvania in particular, like very brief history lesson for non-Pennsylvanians. So the Pennsylvania is actually quite unlike many other US states. It's actually not a state, it's a commonwealth, which in the modern world doesn't mean much, but like in colonial days did, right? So Pennsylvania was founded by Quakers and actually had like quite, like, I don't want to romanticize anything, but Native American Pennsylvanian relations were much better than they were almost anywhere else in the colonies, particularly in the East Coast. So I'm talking less about like Spanish colonies in the Southwest, right? But in the East Coast, like what we think of as the colonies, like the 13 colonies, like Pennsylvania, because it was founded by Quakers and was just like run differently, it had a very different, so like you had to pay Native Americans for land in Pennsylvania. And that did a lot of things. But one of the things it means is that when Pennsylvania became part of the United States, that wasn't true anymore. And the Native Americans here didn't have like a building up period to American aggression. Like they went from friends to just being genocided in a way that they were not. So like here in particular, and especially where I live in Pittsburgh, like I live at a crossroads made out of three big rivers, right? And so it's a hotly, as you might imagine, in any period of history, this is a strategically valuable location with a lot of cultures going through. And that makes like learning about our native and indigenous traditions actually quite difficult. Like that's a lot of different, like the tribes who were here when when British colonizers got here had actually only been here for less than 100 years, et cetera, et cetera. Like I live in a particularly like, because I live at that three-way crossroads of rivers, everywhere has a lot of complicated history, but my history is particularly like multicultural here, way before American colonization, before European colonization, right? But I just really want to stress that like there is this pitfall when we talk about fairy tale magic as an American or a Canadian or an Australian that I think like is not as, I didn't realize that that was a fact about living on stolen land until I started spending a lot of time in Europe and I like saw what it looks like what a magic looks like that is so deeply embedded in the place. And I was saying over the break that like my sister-in-law grew up, I don't know, like less than 20 miles from where her family had lived since like the beginning of fucking time. And even now, she would say she lives far away, but it's like 45 minutes away.
Yeah.
Right. And like ecologically, it's still definitely the same place. You know what I mean? And that's just not. And so I do think that like when we talk about fairy tale magic as someone who lives on colonized land, it's really important to like keep in your mind that that fairy tale world, it's a real place, but it is not the place that you are in. Right. And it's so important to like think about the broad lessons you get from fairy tales, but also really dive into getting to know like your own forest and our own rivers, like where we live.
So this actually connects back into the conversation we had last episode about understanding the why a certain plant is used in a specific spell or worked with in a specific working, right? Or a certain spirit. So the same thing applies. And this is why I wrote Folktales, Fairies and Spirits, which is a Pagan Portals book. It's a pocket-sized book, but it's going through. And I was focusing on Northern European stories but going
Mm-hmm.
through and pulling out this is how you explore the text. And I'm showing you my workings out. These are the stories that I know and that are of the land that I'm on. And this is how, from this, I'm finding these pieces of information. This is where these
Mm-hmm.
ideas come from, that you should offer milk and honey to the fairies. Like, where does that come from? Well, it comes from this part of the story for these reasons. For example, like
Mm-hmm.
as an example, why shouldn't you leave dirty water out overnight? Like those pieces in the stories. And in actual fact, I don't think that was one that I included in there, but you get the gist, right? So why do we have these rules, and why do we have these understandings? Where do they come from in the stories? And how do you find that in not just the stories of your land, but in the landscape of your land, in the
Mm-hmm.
behavior of the beings and the animals? And it's one of those things. So I kind of had it the flip way round. When I was 12, 13, I got my hands on some core shamanism books, and books talking about like shamanic practices and things like that. So right, mid 90s, put it in that
Mm-hmm.
context. And what I was finding is that it was talking about the elemental directions being in a different direction to how the British paganism maps it. And there's all sorts of historical reasons for the way that we do it this way, but also the different animals. And they were talking about, oh, these animals behave in this way, and so they bring this medicine, talk about this, like if they turn up in your dreams, they mean this. And I was there going, this is foreign to me because this is
Mm-hmm.
foreign to my landscape. But
Mm-hmm.
when I reflect on the
Mm-hmm.
why behind it, are the elements in this direction, in this particular version of elemental directions? Why is this animal representing this? Why is this plant an ally in this way? Once you've got the why, then you can start reflecting on who are the plants that hold those whys, who are the animals that do similar behaviors in my ecosystem, who are
Mm-hmm.
my neighbors, and therefore who are the spirits, what is the magic, the embodied spirits and the disembodied spirits and non-embodied spirits, like all, and that
Mm-hmm.
all of that. So yeah, it comes back to that understanding some of the whys and some of the keys, and
I
not
agree.
just doing the steps and taking it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I think, especially for people like me who like do not have access to the native traditions where I live,
Mm-hmm.
which like I cannot even tell you the name of the native peoples who lived here before European colonization. And I want to be clear, I am like a deep dive local historian. So I don't mean I don't know them, like no one. I know who was here when Europeans got here, but they'd only been here. Like they were here because they fled Europeans further to the north and east. And you know, and there was a whole complex. I think a lot of people, even in the United States, like we don't get taught a lot about pre-colonial American history for obvious reasons they don't want us to know about. But like, especially for people who are not American, I think maybe don't fully understand. There was already like a complex political environment happening here where like the Iroquois were like, or the peoples that would become the Iroquois, right? Because the Iroquois is a confederacy of many nations, but like a lot of those peoples were like already engaged in a lot of complex political war, including like genocidal massacre before you like, right? It's not like noble savages, like they had their own shit already because humans are terrible and wonderful, right? Like Europeans didn't introduce slavery or genocide or any of those terrible things to the Americas. Like Native Americans are, you know, fully formed human beings with complex societies with all the bad shit that entails as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, and a lot of that is simply lost, right? And so you can recover it from like the ecology, and you can recover it from like being in relationship with those spirits, and you can recover it by learning like native tales of close by regions. But objectively, like Southern England is ecologically more like where I live than, say, Nevada is,
Hmm.
right? Which is a completely different ecosystem that like is like just it, you know, it's a desert, I live in a forest, like it's just a totally different ecosystem that is unrelated. But I think another really good way is to just read like a lot of magic and folklore from a lot of different cultures, because then you kind of start to see which pieces are universal and which pieces are quite localized, right? And as you learn more about like the history, the historic and cultural context of magic, but also of like magic story, right? I think it helps you like learn how to construct your own magic with your in alliance with your land and with your what I call landcestors, right? Which are not ancestors of blood, but they're like the people who lived and died where I now live and will hopefully I have not died yet. Will I die here? I don't know. Right. But people who have lived and died here both recently, like the people who used to live in my house, and further ago history, like I live on a 17 like I live on a pre-colonial battlefield from what in the States we call the French and Indian War, which I don't the French and Indian War is an American theater of a European war, which is maybe called the 30 Years' War, but I don't know. But in the States, we call it the French and Indian War. But and also for the 40,000 years of human habitation before that, or if you live in the old world, many, many, many more hundreds of thousands of years of human habitation. And so I'm a big like history nerd, but I really think like local history is something we were talking in the previous episode about how like learning from books comes with its own bias and learning from video, but learning from the internet in this very international way that we do, like it comes with its own bias as well. And that's like, I rarely talk about the like super local magic I do because I assume no one listening to this podcast wants to hear me talk about like how I work with grandmother Monongahela, the river in my backyard. I mean, like low key, they do in the ways that it's like working with any other river, but she's not like any other river. She's her own thing. And like, I don't normally talk about that except in my living room or at other local events. And so I think that's another bias that we see is that like, I think if you spoke with a lot of like internet magic teachers, many of them would agree that like a substantial portion of the magic they actually do is very local and very like specific and personal. We just don't talk about that because it's like not universal and therefore not very interesting on YouTube or wherever. I don't even know where this video ends up.
Well, that is actually like, so part of it's that it's local and therefore like hyper local and therefore only useful to the people who are also here. Part of it's that it's personal.
Personal, yeah. Private. I don't necessarily right. Like not everything I do is for public consumption. Like I got my own shit that's not for you.
Yeah, right. And
I mean, maybe you're like my witch sister, but not for the audience that I don't even know.
Right. And like some of my magic is between me and the waves, right?
Exactly.
And that like that's important. But what it all comes back to and what it all comes down to is that magic is really real and those spirits are really there. Those beings are really people that we can interact with. The magic in the land, the ancestors, they're all there. And some of them will want to work with you and some of them won't. And like you build your relationships. But we have this, and I don't know, I can hazard a guess that this sort of comes out of the lineage of monotheism and empire and like all of the stuff that tries to make everything one. I'm forgetting the word for like globally trying to make everything one culture, monoculture, and trying to say, oh, everything's the same. So, well, we have, as human beings, as people, we have more things in common than we have differences. But we do have differences. Like there's more in common as a basic
that narrative, but like, right? Is that true? I don't know.
Like, I mean, it depends on which level you're looking at, but yeah, trying to make everything the same, that impulse to say, oh, everything's the same, actually really has taken away from our ability to, and that the magic is real and that these people are here, these spirit people, these other people, like the other folk. Like when we put all our trust in the books and in what the I mean, speaking as a witchcraft teacher and to another witchcraft teacher, right. It's like, but we're not sat here saying we know all the answers. We're saying here are some tools, go and talk to your people and be with the magic and build that really real magic. Just be
Yeah,
magical. Come on.
100%.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's where like sort of it's one of the things I like about plant magic
Hmm.
because like even though I don't have access to like the folk tale about a plant, I do have access to the plant. Do you know what I mean? And like I get to know that plant. I know how it changes over the seasons. I know how it relates to other plants in its ecosystem. I know it's like biochemistry. And I feel like those things are really like the essence of the plant. Like how do I say, the magical virtues of a plant are almost always like epiphenomena of the like ecological features of that plant and the bio. Not always. Like there are some like cultural things about a plant that like you can't reconstruct in that way, right? But for example, like I know that if a plant can be used to induce an abortion, it is going to be sacred to like Persephone. And similarly, vice versa. Like I know all her sacred plants are useful in that way. Like there's chemical properties of a plant that give rise to like spiritual and cultural features of a plant. But I also think like history and culture the same, right? So I think we hear a lot of talk about closed practices. And some practices certainly aren't closed, which in the context of magic means initiatory.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's what closed practice means. It means it's initiatory, like by invitation only. But almost all magic, it's rooted in some kind of historic and cultural context. And like you don't have to be in that context. Like FYI, the 14th century is closed to all of us. Like the Neolithic era is a closed practice that none of us participate in. Like it is foreign to all of us. But like learning the historical and cultural context of magic, I think is where the real magic is. And when you see magic stripped out of it. So like for example, like I'm Jewish, I teach a lot of like Hebrew and Jewish magic, and I very frequently see Kabbalah taught in this universalist way you were talking about that has stripped it of all its specificity. Like that is a specific practice that is like rooted in a specific culture. And I am not suggesting that Kabbalah is a closed practice. Certain pieces of it are, but actually most of it is not. It is not historically understood that way. It was routinely taught to non-Jews like throughout its entire history, right? Most pieces of it. But rather, it is embedded in that culture in a way when you strip that out and turn it into universalism, like it's not Kabbalah anymore. It's just like Platonism in a Jew costume, but it's not even that because they've also stripped all the specificity out of the Platonism. Like Plato is also a product of a very specific like time and culture. And I really think, I guess all I'm saying is like I really think that like that historic and cultural context, it adds so much depth and richness to the magic that like just doesn't make sense without it.
Yeah.
Right. And I feel at least like most of the magic I learned, especially in my early days, was like fully stripped out of that context. And some of that was like British Wicca, which they didn't know they had stripped the context out of because they were talking to other British people. Like that book was written by a British person for a British person. And so they didn't know I needed to have that explained to me. And as an American, we're sold a lie that that's the same culture.
Yeah.
But it's very obvious when you're in England that you're like, oh, this is the culture they tell us we have. But we have like a terrible plantation. Like the entire US, the United States was set up as a plantation, like a giant plantation. And that becomes obvious when you're in the place like, oh, this is how our masters live. I see. It's very clear now. I understand. And that
And
is not, I really mean it. That was not at all obvious to me until not as a tourist. Like, you know, my family lives there. So I spend like non-touristy time there because of the nature of my work. I can just work from my brother's house for like a month at a time. And like, and it was not at all like it becomes so obvious. And then I think, and then knowing that it became obvious in everything.
yeah.
Right? Like, oh, that's everything. I'm missing that context for everything. So I really go back and really like dive deep into it. And I think in the modern world, there is this real desire to conflate culture with genetics.
Mm.
Is such like colonialist slave master blood quantum bullshit. Like who your genetics are, that's not your culture. Like if you don't participate, like I said this before, maybe that was a whole the for the audience, this may have been a week ago for you, I'm not sure. But like I grew up with like two intact cultures, like a Jewish culture and a Greek culture that I like participated in. And but I also have relatives. I actually do have relatives, like genetic ancestors from England. Like my father's mother was adopted, but genetic tests suggest she's probably Scots Irish, which I mean would have been what I would guess from what she looked like, and also like just the demography of where she grew up and etc. But honestly, like really know anything. Like I don't think of myself as Scots Irish in any way. Like I have no my only connection to that culture is in our shared history of British colonialism. Like the British fucked them too. So I guess we share that in common, which, you know, most of the world shares.
Yeah. And that
Right.
and like
I don't know
likewise,
where I'm going. Sorry, I've kind of veered off the
it's all
topic
right,
of
but
magic. But
it's also likewise like I my maternal grandmother, her family were Polish. They came over as
mm-hmm.
refugees in the war, settled here.
Right.
So like I have Polish ancestry. I know nothing about their culture apart from that they are also in Northern Europe. Um,
Mm-hmm.
you know, that's about as far as it goes. And I don't know how to even pronounce the way that the letters are put together in my
Mm-hmm.
grandmother's maiden name. Um, she spelled it out for me and then said it for me, and it went in one ear and straight out of the other. And I wrote it down a few times, and I still can't quite grasp it. But like that, genetics is not culture.
No. And I'm not saying like blood ancestry doesn't matter. Like I do think that like working with your blood ancestors, like
Yeah,
there's value in that,
and
both
that's
as a human being and as a magician.
yeah,
But
like
that's like not
there is
what
a
ancestor means in a healthy culture.
right, like
Like you don't learn about your ancestors from a genetic test.
there's a
That's not how
thread
that's supposed to work.
that I could follow back magically through the
Mm-hmm.
family lines if I wanted to. And you know, I've done a little bit of this of working back with my grandmothers, you know,
Mm-hmm.
and to go and meet them as ancestors who probably care about me because I'm down line from them.
Right.
And but in order to communicate with them, in order to like understand what they're telling me beyond hi, we're family, like there's huge amounts of stuff that I'm missing. So like all of
Oh,
this
for sure.
and all of this plays in, like you're talking about the southwest England being Narnia, and of
Right.
course the Shire, that was modeled on various parts of the Shire. I grew up in Wiltshire, like where the place I grew up in, the town I grew up in was a bit of a black hole, but I was a half-hour bus journey away from Avebury. So,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and I there's even that piece, like compared to England, Wales has this reputation for being a fantasy land. It's the land of dragons and druids, right? And there's a thing in the news at the moment in the papers about, oh, romance novels are messing around with Welsh culture, and it means that people are like they're just mixing and matching names and taking it all out of context. It's like, well, yeah, because it sounds magical and because people associate it with magic. So there's that aspect happening. And then there's also the piece that when you sit on the land itself, not just the
Mm-hmm.
stories, but the actual land itself, when I sit on the hill a little way down the coast from where I am, amongst the gorse flowers, and feel the sea spray, like I feel the story and the magic from a
Mm-hmm.
Mabinogi, but
Right.
I would
Whereas, like
feel
for
there.
comparison, I don't
Yeah,
know what a gorse flower is. We don't have those.
right.
If one was in front of me, I could not even identify. And I'm a plant nerd, so I could identify a lot of plants, but I wouldn't know a gorse flower if I was eating it.
And you
This is
can eat
just
it.
well, there you go. It sounded like something that could be eaten. I think I've probably heard about it, probably in a fairy tale. I think there's also something to say, and I think I'm going to ask you, but like, you know, I didn't grow up speaking Hebrew or Greek or Yiddish, right? But I've since, as an adult, I've like taught myself some, and even a tiny, like you were talking about, like you don't know how to say Romanian, like I realized encourage, in addition to like getting to know your own land, like the cultures that you work in, whether that's the culture of the land where you live or not, it's the culture of your ancestors or just some other culture. Like there's certain parts of my magic, like I do a non-trivial amount of Haitian voodoo, which occurred because I like lived with a Haitian for many years. And it just like, so, right. Like there are a lot of pieces of my magic, or like I have a relationship with Freya, which is based entirely on like my godmother's relationship with Freya. That like it just came into my life in that way. But learning even a tiny bit of the language, I think, really like opens up in the same way that sitting on the land opens you up to a kind of spirit communion. Even a very small amount of a language really like opens you up to a culture in a mundane sense and also a magical sense, which I do not believe to actually be different senses, like in the same way. And I know like you didn't grow up in Wales, you live there now, and you do speak some Welsh, yes? Like you've learned some?
Tipyn bach.
Right.
Dwi'n
But
dysgu
like
siarad Cymraeg. I'm learning.
yeah,
I've been
right.
learning
And
for a long time. But yeah, and it
I do
does.
think I don't know about you, but I feel like even the time like learning the Hebrew alphabet,
Yeah.
just the alphabet, like unlocked huge vistas, right? And even like a few words here and there in Yiddish, like really opens up a culture in a way that I think is really valuable. So even if you can't like go sit on the land, which is perhaps a bigger investment, like it's not that easy for like I've never been to Israel. I will say I do not necessarily, especially if things continue going the way they're going, I do not anticipate going to Israel. I will also say I do have a secret worry that were I to move to Israel, I might have to live in a cave outside Jerusalem for the rest of my life because that's a thing that happens to people who go to Jerusalem, and I'm the kind of person that happens to, and I don't want to live in a cave, so I have not gone. Right. Um, but like learning the language, even so, I really encourage people, even little tiny pieces of the language, especially if you learn it by like conversation or like watching kids shows produced in that language. I think is a much more like a better way to learn it, particularly for this kind of reason than something like Duolingo, where the language has been stripped of its cultural context in that way.
Yeah.
So that's just like another, but none of this, I mean, all of this is sort of about magic, but maybe we should.
well, let's show like I think all of it is all about magic. And
Yeah.
On a like learning language note, if you are pagan, magical, whatever, and interested in Welsh mythology and the magic from Wales, I very highly recommend Mara Starling's Welsh Through Myth and Legend course. It's because, and here's the thing that you were talking about, like the language has hints in it about the way in which magic in that landscape and in that culture is understood, is related to, and the way in which it works. And as we were talking about last week, in English, like the English speakers who did magic have been burned or beaten or hung, or it's we have lost a lot of our nuanced language in order to speak about these topics.
Right. And even the nuance we have, it's suited to English magic.
Yes.
And not like as someone who translates magic a lot, like there's no, it's like translating poetry. Like there's no such thing as a literal translation. If it's literal, you're doing it wrong. Like that's not what you're supposed to be doing. But like, so even when like we sort like the nature of a magic is like woven into life. So when I teach ancestor work, I teach like categories of ancestors, right? There's blood ancestors, there's land ancestors, and then there's also like ancestors of language, which I do not have a catchy name for. I tried langcestors, but it's stupid. But like, yeah, it's not a good one. Land ancestors, that one's catching on. But like, and I'm these words. But like when I work with like King Arthur, like I do have this inheritance of English culture that comes through language, right? And that's important to understand and acknowledge as well. And like in ancient days, and I might go so far as to say in like maybe a better, healthier world, like, there would be more of a relationship between your ancestors of blood and your ancestors of language and your land ancestors, but not always. Like my Jewish ancestors, like that is a culture that lives in diaspora, right? I'm going to just side there is a complex argument going on in Judaism right now about the relationship between diasporic Judaism and Zionist Judaism. And I'm going to put that aside for now. But until the founding of the modern state of Israel, like Judaism is a culture that existed almost entirely in diaspora, like as this crossroads culture. And that's interesting. And it's one of the things I really like about Jewish magic is that it is like, unlike a lot of other maybe ancient magics, like it's really designed to be done in an urban context, in a foreign land, like in all these ways that like are how I live today, as opposed to like when I look at like, old Anglo-Saxon magic that is all about like working the field. Like it's just not as relevant to my life as this more like urban, cosmopolitan, diasporic magic where I live. Like I understand you live much less in diaspora. Like even though you didn't grow up in Wales, it's like not so far.
Yeah.
Right. And like technically the United Kingdom, although I appreciate that like at least my Welsh friends don't care for that fact. So we'll put that off in the same category, right?
No, as an English person living in Wales, I
Yeah.
very, very careful with that because there is what is obviously often not understood over in America is just because
Right.
we are a very small island, we all live together, there is a huge amount of history of conflict between the English, the Welsh, the Scots, and the Irish, specifically between the English and all the other three. So the dynamics are iffy. There's a long, complicated history
Right.
for all of that, which is really actually quite simple. But
Right.
but the short version is like, yeah, I live in Wales, but the culture here is not so different to where I grew up. The landscape is connected, and the moment that I got out of the car in the middle of Wales, where I went to university 20 years ago, I felt home in a way that I had never felt anywhere before. It was like the land said, yes, welcome home.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, that is a very, very different experience for a lot of people around the world. Um, you know, and there is still that thing that we live in the
Mm-hmm.
urban spaces, which is different from needing to till the fields, even when we live like there's a lot of countryside around where I live. Like, well, I still live in a town,
Right.
right? So yeah, that there was a piece you said about learning the alphabet, the Hebrew alphabet,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm currently taking Sarah's Solomonic Magic course year long. It's absolutely fabulous, and what I love about it is that it's giving the context. It's giving context for things that I'd seen images of, and gone, oh yeah, if you draw this and write these words and say these words, it'll do this magic. And like actually coming and finding out the why behind it means that suddenly this magic is working. But one of the pieces that I'm
Mm-hmm.
doing is learning the alphabet, the Hebrew alphabet.
Mm-hmm.
And just that, like a couple of hours spent watching some kids, this is how you draw an aleph, and this is how you draw a bet.
Mm-hmm.
And these are some of and I was looking up, like, because there are different forms of it. And I started to find out that each of the words had different meanings and they've got and it's sort of opening up the space of the magic that is in these words. And the words themselves aren't just letters, they're not just sounds. Each of the sounds has meaning, and they
Mm-hmm.
combine in different ways. And like, so all of those aspects of language being different to how I'm used to language being is
Right.
opening up a different relationship for me with magic.
And one of the things, like, even if you don't want to do like Hebrew magic, learning the Hebrew alphabet, I think is really good for magicians broadly. All modern alphabets, like not not characters for writing, right? So many Asian languages are written ideographically, where each like symbol represents an idea, right? And only later comes to represent a sound. But all modern, strictly like phonetic alphabets, right? Where like the letters encode sounds, all of them are based on Hebrew. Like Hebrew is the original, I mean, Paleo Hebrew is the original alphabet. But of modern languages, like Hebrew is by far, like by millennia the closest to that. And so I think like learning the Hebrew alphabet also unlocks the magic of the Greek alphabet and also unlocks the magic of the Latin alphabet, which is basically the English alphabet. And like it really, I think, so I really recommend it to people. But I also think that sometimes people learn it again in this like way completely divorced from the culture in which it's started, and also in which the culture, like, there's a 3,000-year history of relationship with that alphabet with humans that I think is valuable. But yeah, just learning like tiny pieces of a language, the alphabet, just like a couple of words, how to sound out words that are written in that language. I think it makes a huge difference. Like in terms of the effort you put in and like the value you get out, I just think it's like huge compared to many other kinds of like I see people memorize like giant tables of information, which like when I was new in magic, I did too, because I'm a nerd who likes memorizing giant tables of information. But like actually it's the little pieces that make a big difference. Like people who can tell me all about what they think the tree of life is, but do not know the Hebrew alphabet, they're like missing the point. Like they don't actually know what they're talking about. Like they're talking about something, but that thing they're talking about is Platonism, but made more complicated. Well, like you don't get any of the value out of the making it more complicated. And I like Neoplatonism. Like I'm not shitting on that, but it's its own thing.
And that's the thing, isn't there? There is over 100-year history of the like Golden Dawn derived tree of life thing, like that. It's its own thing, and that's fine, and it works for many people, arguably.
I will say it's not clear to me that it does. Like when I ask them what they get out of it, I find they often struggle to answer that question. Like it's just a useful way to categorize things. But that's not what it is or what it's for.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But yeah, that's maybe a whole conversation for another time.
That being said, I want to say that like there are certain kinds of like English Kabbalah that are great. They're very effective, and they're not just they're like their own thing.
Awesome. Can you recommend if someone goes, oh, that sounds interesting, can you recommend a source for those?
Yes, but not live. So remind me, like there's a book, but if I think like I straight up don't know what that book is called, but I will hunt it down. There is like yes, there are people I would recommend, and by the time you guys are seeing this, there will be a link down here somewhere about what they are.
Have a look for the links if you're interested.
Which I was shocked. Like I wrote off English Kabbalah as stupid for a long time because I've only seen stupid people do it in stupid ways. But recently I like saw English magicians doing it. And I was like, oh, this makes sense. This is the magic of East London. Totally get
it. Pretty sure I know which book you're talking about, and it's on my shelf. So yeah. Check out the comment box. But this kind of comes back, and I want to bring this round to the not just the magic of language, but also the magic of voice and words in general. Like, I'm a storyteller. I love the way in which we can weave magic with those words. And like there's different ways of doing that, right? There's sharing information for other people to integrate into their knowledge bank and act on. And there's using words in such a way that they are a spell in and of themselves. And then there's the goetic howling and the summoning through words and voice. So anything you'd like to talk about on any of those?
So coming back to what we were talking about at the very beginning of the previous podcast about like this difference between like oral culture and written culture.
Yes.
I think in the modern world, when we think about language, we sometimes fall into this trap that like writing is somehow like that written language is the essence of language, and then speaking is just making sounds for writing. But that's absurd. There are like hundreds of thousands of years of human language before writing, right? That like in its essence, language is shapes you make out of your breath, right? And that like there's also a big difference between like an oral teaching and a written teaching. And that today we live in a world that really blurs that distinction. Like this, as you and I do it, is an oral teaching. But as people experience it on video, it is effectively a written teaching. It has become crystallized. It says exactly one thing, that's what it says. But stories aren't like that. Like a story is different when different storytellers tell it, but it's even different every time the same storyteller tells it, right? It like it interacts with the audience and with the moment in a way that like is different. And I think in Judaism would make a big difference about that distinction between oral teaching and written teaching. And Kabbalah, by the way, is exclusively oral. Like written Kabbalah is technically not really Kabbalah at all in a certain sense. Like it is an oral tradition in the sense that it like the word Kabbalah literally means received, like what a master, like what an apprentice receives from their master, but also in the sense of like divine revelation. And that is like an ongoing and very fluid thing. And I think we also miss out. Like what I was saying, like there's a book bias and a video bias and an internationalist, universalist bias in our magic, but there's very much this sort of like crystalline bias, right? That what I say now has to be the same as what I say tomorrow. Because if I say something in this interview and then I'm on another podcast and I say it slightly differently, somebody's gonna like cut those two clips and put them back. I'm like, oh, Mastros just talks out of both sides of her face. I'm like, yeah, that's magic. That's how that works. Like I'm supposed to be doing that, right? But I do, and I'm a big believer in, I'm not a singer, right? And I'm not like a professional storyteller. Like I'm charming and good with words, but I'm not like a storyteller the way Halo is, right? And like I'm not an actor or performer or any of that. And yet, when I'm doing my own magic, I will say for me, the most common kind of magic I do, like this piece is in almost everything I do, starts off with a chant, right? And that chant is often for me in Hebrew or Greek, not always, but often. And it's often effectively just a list of names. Something that's not always clear in translation, but like the orphic hymns in Greek are like 80% just a list of names of a god, right? So like Hecate, the door opener, the of the streets, the three face. It's just like a list of these names with not a lot of like narrative content, as well as like the Homeric hymns, which more tell stories, right? So my chants start off as that, but they pretty quickly sort of slip into glossolalia, right? So I'll start off Hecate, Enovia, Triaditis, which is like the beginning of Hecate's Orphic hymn. And I sometimes will recite the whole hymn, sometimes in Greek, sometimes in English, but a lot of times I will like get stuck sort of on a certain name. And I just find myself repeating that name over and over. And sometimes it just like morphs into some sounds, right? And eventually those sounds are like, ooh, ooh, ah, and like I'm making crazy like animal noises. And like, I really mean it. That is like probably the most common thing that happens in my magic. So I don't actually do that on video. I will say if you dig through my YouTube, there's the only time I have ever just videotaped myself doing magic. Like not teaching, not explaining. It's just a video of me doing it. It's really just smoke and me. And if you, so it's, I think it's called like, I don't even know. There's only one. It's called like wealth building ritual play along at home or something. I'll find a link and we'll put a link down here. It's just straight up me like making weird noises for an hour. And I will say I actually regret putting it on YouTube. But it's already out there. But it's like it's like a more, remember what we were saying about some magic is private and just for me? That yeah. There are a few things that I have publicized that I actually regret having publicized, and that is one of them. But it's out there, so you might as well learn from it. But I do think that like I'm a big believer in like glossolalia and like weird staccato rhythms and all of that in magic. Like for me, I would say that really is like almost every piece of magic that I'm doing for myself, not doing for an audience, not doing for like as instruction for someone else, but just me. Almost always that is a component for me. Like I just love to make weird sounds, speak the language of the birds. I guess that's like a magician. Here's a pro tip that I didn't understand for a long time, by the way. In English, not fairy tales that originated in England so much, but in English tellings, particularly of like Greek and Hebrew and biblical stories and things that inherit from that, which of course is most of British folklore. Like when we experience British paganism, we're pretty much exclusively experiencing it through the lens of a Christian overlay, which is another nice thing about Hebrew and Greek is that like the writing predates Christianity, so you get to see what it looks like, right? Whereas in Northern Europe, like they didn't write it down, so you're really only getting to see what the monks wrote down. Questionable. Like all the parts you learn from the land and the spirits and etc. But like, right? But when we say the language of the birds, that means talking to spirits. Like that's what that means. But I didn't put that together for a long, like nobody explained that to me. And it took me a long time to put together that like when they say like Solomon speaks the language of the birds, they don't mean just birds. Like they mean everything. He just speaks spirit speak. He can talk to anything. Right. And that for me is like a really core feature of my magic. Like my magic is deeply linguistic in that way. Because, you know, remember at the very beginning, I was saying, like, if you're a musician, lean into music. And if you're an artist, lean into artists. But I'm like a writer, like, I'm a word person. And so I really lean into the wordiness. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you too, I know.
Yeah.
So here, I'm going to say something that like we did not agree to say out loud, but at some point in the future, Halo and I are thinking about co-teaching a course on this kind of like vocal magic.
Yes.
I think we're going to call it Howling for Beginners, introductory vocal Goetia or something. And it'll be amazing. So if you want that to happen, and by want to happen, we mean will give us money to make that happen.
Yeah.
I mean, it's also like there will be payment plans and scholarships available, but the reality is some amount of people need to pay us to make things happen. Like, please in the comments tell us to do that, and we will move it higher on the list of priorities. Yeah. We did not agree to say that, so I don't think I was supposed to say that out loud, but I did. You're welcome.
Yeah. If you want Howling for Beginners, tell us.
Tell us, and we will make that happen.
And we will make that happen.
Because we want to make that happen, so it won't be that hard to convince us.
Yeah. No, we just
sooner or later, but the more people are excited, the sooner it will happen.
Yeah, the sooner we can put aside that time and craft something wonderful for you where you use your voice and speak the language of the birds.
Right. Here, can I teach everybody one right now?
I would love
so this
that.
is like this is like an orphic. Okay, let me back up a little bit. For me, there is very little distinction between the kind of like weird noise magic I am talking about and like breath magic.
Yes.
Right? That like the making the weird noises, it's making shapes out of your breath and it's about. So here is like an orphic initial. Okay, so two things. First of all, the way we say amen in orphic is like you're calling a pig. That I don't know if this is true anywhere else, but in rural America, we have contests at like state fairs for who can make the best pig squeal noise. Like that's a thing that happens at a Pennsylvania state fair. I don't know if that happens elsewhere.
I want to try it, but I don't know if I've ever made this noise before, so it could come out really weird. Hopefully.
It's hard if you've never been around pigs. Like if you've never been on a pig farm. That's not bad.
Okay.
Right. So in English, it's often spelled E-U-O-I. Like that's how we spell that noise in English. So if you see that in like ancient Greek stuff, that's the sound, but it's a pig squeal, right? And it's maybe the squeal that a baby piglet makes as you slit its throat and sacrifice it, right? But that's the noise. But it's also the noise that pigs make when they're having sex. It's the noise as a farmer you would like make to call pigs to you. And presumably as a wild boar hunter, I don't know. But that's how you say amen, right? But Orphism has a lot of those kind of noises, right? So another one, and this is sort of an initiatory noise, it's like a trance induction noise. And what you do, how it's described in the ancient texts, is that you roar like a bull, then hiss like a snake. So I'll do it in a second, but I want to talk about like physiologically, what you're doing is like vibrating in your chest. I cannot make a noise like a cow. Like, first of all, my voice, I have such a like, I mean, you guys are listening to it right now, but I assure you, I get a lot of phone calls like, oh, is your mom or your daddy at home? Like, I know what my voice sounds like. There's a comment on my YouTube that says she sounds like a perpetual gargle. It's the only like flu in that video in my defense. But understand what quality of my voice they were talking about. It's the only YouTube video. So like, you can't, those super low, like bellowing noises, I'm gonna do my best, right? And then, so you're gonna like vibrate in your chest, right? And the actual noise I think is less important. Like move it around So musicians are always asking me like, "Oh, what note?" And like, I don't think it's about a right note. And also, I couldn't tell you anyway. It's about like getting it to vibrate in your own chest, and what note that is like depends on the size of your chest and your vocal apparatus, chords, whatever. I don't really know how voices work, right? And then so you're gonna make that vibrating, and then you're gonna like squeeze every last drop of air out of your lungs, like you're rolling up a toothpaste tube, right? That's what we're doing. And you're going to do that over and over until you make yourself dizzy, right? So here's what it sounds like. Oh.
You've gone bright red.
Oh. I have a little bit of a cold, so I am realizing that I'm like fucking my voice up doing this too much. But that's this noise, right? So here, do you want to try it and the audience can try it?
Yeah, I will try it, but you know what I'm going to do just to make myself really vulnerable? I'm going to put original audio for musicians.
Oh yeah, okay. Let me do it once more once you turn that off
Yeah.
because it does something. This is pro tip for anybody who does magic over Zoom. There's this setting deep in the settings called like original music, original sound for musician. And if you don't turn that on, then Zoom like will noise cancel out all your weird noises, especially if more than one person is making weird noises at once.
Well, it has it turned it on? No, it hasn't given us the option
I don't
yet.
know.
Because it cut out the second part of the second half of the low part of your
Okay.
voice. So, oh no, there you go. It should
Hmm.
have done. So, right,
Well, I'm
try
gonna
it
rest my
again.
voice while you find that setting.
Try it. I think I found it. So try it again.
All right, blow my nose. Okay, let me try again. Oh.
It dropped it. So let's try this.
I will say I've heard musicians that are my students do this, and they get a slightly smoother transition between the moaning and the hissing that I don't know how to do. Oh, one more time.
Yeah, you do it one more
Tell me
time.
when.
Try it now.
Hmm.
I've changed a different setting. So, and then I'll give it a go.
Oh.
Oh, I love how red you go with it. Um, it didn't. It doesn't appear to have gotten the setting right, and I don't know why. But thank you for doing that again.
I'm getting dizzy because this is a trance induction technique. So like I will say like I can only do this so many times in a row and then come back to being a person immediately.
Yeah, I know
But
absolutely.
try it and I'll tell if
I
you're
will
doing it
try
right.
it. I will try it.
Really, it really is just about the key part is like vibrating and then just squeeze all the air, like hiss until you literally have no air left for hissing.
Okay. All right. Come over all shy. How was that?
Yeah. I mean, that in and out. I understand what you're saying. It cut out in and out a bunch of times. But yeah, you definitely like the pieces I heard, you definitely got it. And you can feel how if you did that not even that many times in a row, but like without a gap, like if you just immediately pull in and do it again, it only takes like 3 or 4 rounds of that before you're like quite trancy. So that's like an orphic trance technique that again, I believe I found in the PGM, but it just says bellow like a bull, then hiss like a snake. And it took a little bit for me to figure out what they meant. Also, having grown up in farm country, I do like know what they're talking about when they say bellow like bull. Like I've heard bulls make that noise. I just, as a puny human, especially a puny human who sounds like an 8-year-old girl, cannot make that noise with my human body. So that's the
Yeah,
best I can do.
that's it's hard work, and I could kept it going for much longer than I expected to. I'm like, I keep expecting to run out of air, and I haven't yet. That was something that surprised me actually.
Right. It's
Yeah.
also really good, just like exercise for your lungs. Like I have a friend who's a respiratory therapist, and she's like, "Yeah, do that." Because I'll tell you guys, I smoke a lot of weed, so like, I also do a lot of breath exercises. I will say breath exercises like formal pranayama, but also this kind of like any kind of breathing exercise. Singers know a lot of breathing exercise if you ask them. Like I find those quite valuable in magic because your breath is very intimately tied to like your state of consciousness. And if you don't believe that, just hold your breath until you do. And you will discover that your breath is intimately tied to consciousness very closely.
Yeah.
Right.
So
I like blew my voice up.
oh no. Well, we're actually coming
That's fine.
to up on an hour at this point, and we didn't get back to the like what story was it, or like possibly piece of fiction that made you realize that
Oh.
magic really was real. And we the homework we set was like ideally a fairy tale or a folk tale, but it could be another story as well. So
So for me, it was a lot of different things because truthfully, I like never doubted that magic was really, really real.
mhm.
But it was clear to me that like the stories I was hearing, it was a little bit missing. So I'll tell you, for me, the first one was actually a poem, and
Mm.
it was a poem that was in my, I think it was seventh grade, maybe sixth grade. Let's say seventh grade. Ancient, which okay, so for non-Americans, that means I'm about 13 or 14 in this story, right? I had an ancient history class with by far the best teacher I had in my entire like school career. Her name was at that point Ms. Kimbaum, but she married and divorced several times. Like I had her again in like 11th grade. I think she'd gone through like two last names, but right. But Ms. Kimbaum, she would later work for our State Department of Education, I believe. Um, and we had this in addition to our regular textbook, we had another textbook called Primary Sources in Ancient History, right? And it had something that was simply labeled a spell from ancient Mesopotamia with no context. I have since bought that book to look. It does not tell where that spell is from. But I will say now, I am such a fucking nerd. I believe, based on the tenor of the poetry, that that is a Thorkild Jacobson translation of Mukul Tablet 4, because
Hats
I'm a
off
nerd.
to you. Hats off to
But
you.
yeah, but it
Beautiful.
goes like this, or I won't do the whole thing because it's a curse. But it goes, scorching fire, warlike son of heaven, fiercest of thy brethren, burn the man or woman who stands against me. And I read that and I was like, oh yes, this is what they've been hiding from me. I feel it. I
Mm.
feel it in my bones. And it wasn't until I was writing orphic hymns, 30 years later, that I realized that like the structure of that poem, which isn't even the original poem, right? It's a translation, and I'm pretty sure I know who the translator is because I recognize his poetic voice and other things. Like it so informs the way that I think magic sounds. Like when I write magic, I can feel myself like reaching for that magic voice. And I had seen it other places, like sometimes in little chants and fairy tales, sometimes in the TV show Gargoyles had, in my opinion, particularly good magic in it. I have done many spells that I lifted directly from that cartoon show. There's a conjuration of Puck that's in Latin where you conjure Puck through a mirror, and like highly recommend. Um, you need a mirror and a gold ring. That's I think it's on my blog. I'll hunt it down. I'll link to it. It's in Latin, and like I performed it, and like I don't know, fairy came through the mirror, excellent, right? But it was similarly like for me, what won me over was the poetry of it. There was just something about, and even today, as a person who writes magic poetry, I could not identify exactly what it is about certain combinations of sounds and like certain meters that I'm like, oh, well, that's the real magic. I can taste it. You know what I mean? But that was, I would say, my first experience because I knew magic was real. And I was learning magic from like trees and ghosts. But like I had to reconstruct it. Like it's not like this fairy tale had the exact spell in it. Like I could feel pieces of it. But that was the first time I laid hands on it. I was like, oh, this. I would like more of this. And I did ask Ms. Kimbom for more, and she gave me the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is awesome, and I learned a lot, but was not what I wanted, which was apparently Moocool Tablet 4. That my reiterate, my history textbook did not cite a source. What the actual fuck, textbook writer? I can only imagine that was an intentional decision to prevent children. Like, I can only imagine that in the proof, because other things in that book had sources. So I must imagine that somebody was like, you cannot tell school children where this spell, like, you can't do that, which was probably a wise choice. Like, I should not have been able to get the Moocool tablets at 13. Not that I would have been able to. But yeah, so for me, when I think about it, that's the piece, which I know is not actually the assignment I gave, which was like fairy tale. But for me, that was the one that I tasted it. The girl who used to bully me caught her hair on fire in a chem lab very shortly after that. And then she fell down the stairs and broke her arm. And as an adult, I would feel bad about that. But I mean, she definitely deserved it. Like, she was terrible. Like, this was like hardcore. I did not know what a bad culture of bullying the school I came up in had until I went to college and talked to other people and found out that, like, I would tell stories like, oh yeah, they used to throw dead frogs at me. And they were like, what? Like, I just thought that because on TV that's normal, so I just thought it was normal. But it turns out it is not normal. Like, I grew up in a school with a real culture of. Side note, as a teacher, when a school has a culture of bullying, it's because the teachers are bullies. Like, it is 100%. As a teacher and a school administrator, I will tell you, is 100% within the power of the faculty to prevent that behavior. But my teachers were also bullies, so
yeah,
sadly is more common than you might think.
Oh. Yes.
At least in the States, where our education system is a clusterfuck.
It is unfortunately something that does happen. So they threw frogs at you and you set them on fire. Fair play.
And then they threw frogs at me again. You actually only have to set. I mean, I read the spell out loud in class while staring directly at that girl. So really, from that point on, I never got bullied again.
Well done.
Like, that was really the end of it. Yeah.
Oh.
So if you're getting bullied at school, kids, you only got to set one person on fire. With magic.
Where they can see it. Like, they need to know that that's what's happened so they can put 2 and 2 together and stop.
But yeah, cursed her, and then like 2 periods later, she leaned her hair, which was full of chemicals. You know, actually, if your hair's not full of chemicals, it does not catch on fire as soon as it touches a Bunsen burner. So, I mean, she was fine. Yeah. She wasn't fine later because she fell down the stairs and broke her.
Yeah, that's a little less.
It got better.
Okay. Well, as you say, as an adult, you feel bad about it now. But
yeah, again, I would not do that as an adult. I felt a little bit bad about it, even then. Like, I didn't. Setting her hair on fire, fine. That seemed totally fair. She was fine. The broken arm, I thought healed the whole way, but then I turned 40 and every injury I ever had was like, oh no, fuck you.
Oh, yes, of course. Of course.
Right? Like, I broke my arm as a kid and I thought it was fine until I got old. And they're like, oh no, remember that time you were 6 and fell off a jungle gym? You're never going to forget it again.
Yeah. But yeah, there we go. So, you know, as magicians, as witches, each, you know, I highly recommend that people reflect on their own ethics and develop a
for sure
ethical code that you then follow.
Yeah. It's important to understand that, like, ethics are different when you have power.
Yeah.
Unempowered. So as a kid with no power, in this position where I was being routinely oppressed, like fighting back. That is different than now, where objectively, in both a like real world sense, like I have some money and privilege and power, but also in a magical sense, like I'm the powerful one in most interactions in my life, and that changes things. So again, like, I think everybody who gets into magic as a kid does a lot. Like all teenagers do a lot of dumb, stupid shit. I can say with certainty because I taught high school for a long time. Like teenagers do dumb shit. All of them, even the smart ones, even the good ones do tons of dumb, terrible, like mean, unethical shit because they don't know any better. Uh, but like, so I think everybody who got into magic early has that. But if you get in as an adult, no excuse for that shit. Like, you need to get your shit together.
Yeah. Yeah.
Be a like upstanding person, and you need to figure out for yourself what that
Yeah. Absolutely.
is. What we'll
So,
so, what about you? What was your like touched it and it was magic?
touched it and it was magic. See, like that's again a really difficult one because I was lucky enough to find that book of rituals
All right. Uh-huh.
at about the point at which I would like I wasn't quite starting to, but I suspect had it continued, I'd have started to lose my faith in the magic. I mean,
I found witchcraft books then too. Like I had already read more than one book on witchcraft when I found that
mm,
seventh grade spell, and I was like, oh, this is what those books aren't teaching me.
yeah, but
Like this is what was missing.
the
Yours
story
sounds like it was better than mine.
it was definitely a
Your
good.
starting book, I think, was better than mine.
It was I was definitely very very lucky to find
Yeah.
that really really. What was interesting was that I didn't then go down a ritual magic path.
Mm-hmm.
I sought out every book I could get my hands on, but 11-year-old
Yeah, right.
mid 90s, that was mostly neo Wicca and the occasional book
Mm-hmm.
on pop shamanism. um
Right, that's what I was finding too.
yeah. So but what I also found was RJ Stewart's Living World of Fairy,
Mm-hmm.
so non-fiction, but within that he had the ballad of Thomas the Rhymer, and
Mm-hmm.
that for me, that poem or whatever, like the book of rituals made me realize, oh, there are adults in the world who believe that this stuff that I'm encountering is real. And
Mm-hmm.
next step, oh, there are people who think that witches are real. Great. That's what I am. Then logical thinking, if witches are real, like other beings must be real. Fine. And I, at that point, like get to hold on to,
Mm-hmm.
if I can encounter it and experience it, I will then reflect on what it is and what it might be,
Mm-hmm.
and decide for myself on what is real and what isn't real. But that the Ballad of Thomas the Rhymer, where the fairy queen turns up for a human being on the edge of a river, sleeping under a tree, and takes him away to fairyland, and he has to behave himself and follow certain rules, and then he comes back with the tongue that cannot lie. And like that, something about that story, it's not a very gripping, like exciting story. There's no car chases or sex scenes, as my partner's always telling me, throw in a car chase. I'm like, no, no, they didn't have cars, why would I do that? But there was something about it, about the journey through the realms, that really resonated with me. And there was this question that came up for me at the end, which was, he was given the tongue that could not lie, and he then wrote prophecy. He was a real person who then wrote prophecy. And I'm like, okay, did he write prophecy because he couldn't lie about what was going to happen in the future? Or did he write the future into being because what he said had to be true because he could not lie? And that fundamentally shaped my approach to magic.
Mm-hmm.
And
I think about that a lot as well because I am vaguely familiar with that story, but only in like a vague academic adult way. Like that's not a story I grew up with, right?
mm-hmm,
But that idea that like you speak magic into being, and what is the difference between like that and telling prophecy? I think about that a lot, and I couldn't say. I will say when I'm doing it, it feels like I just open my mouth and stuff comes out.
Yes, yes.
Like it feels indistinguishable from lying.
Okay.
It's not exactly true, but like it feels like I'm making it up. Like it's not like I have a thought and then like I it just opened my mouth and stuff comes out. And yeah, like I couldn't say, and I will say more and more the more I think about it. And like I'm not playing a nerd card, but I did spend many years in academic math with a specialty in like the geometry of space time. And I think the answer is like it's actually like that's not actually how time works.
Yeah.
Right? So it is simultaneously like both of those things that like the underlying geometry of nature, not just in a physical sense, but also in a temporal sense, is fractal and like self-similar. So everything that will ever happen is also happening inside this tiny moment, and et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, I think about that a lot
Yeah.
because that's a thing I do. I open my mouth and tell prophecy.
Yeah.
Uh, but maybe I'm making things happen and I don't want to like doom speak. Yeah, no, I agree. I think about that a lot.
For me, it feels like that in that space, the words are simply true. They are that it is it like specifically in that space. They just happen to be what is.
You know,
And
I'll say
so I couldn't
for
tell you
me,
which way the causation goes.
it really troubles me. They don't feel true when I say them. Like there is not a feeling. I'm like, oh, like I've learned to trust it,
Mm,
right? That like it is true, but the sensation inside of me does not come with some kind of like verification of truth. Like I hear nonsense coming out of my mouth, and there's like some tiny part in the back of my brain where I'm like, is that true? No. And it's really like I remember like in that Italy retreat, we like talked about it, right? But for
yeah,
me, it's a very I does not feel like I don't come with that built-in truth sense. Maybe it's all lies, but it does come true. So who knows?
yeah. And like maybe the question isn't whether or not it's true, or maybe it is just like what I'm describing as oh, it feels true is it is. Does that make sense? Like what it just is.
It definitely feels like the words just are. Like I feel them coming into existence in my mouth
Hmm.
in that moment. I don't know. I will say like I have heard, having had this conversation with many magicians, I think your experience is more typical than.
Maybe.
So I will say my many years in academic math made me quite skeptical about the nature of truth and if it exists at all.
Yeah.
Like I'm skeptical that true is actually a word that defines a thing that exists in the world. Like I'm not sure human language can ever be true. Like I don't think you can say true things in words. You can just moan like a bull and hiss like a snake, and that's as good as you can do to truth, I think. But
Oh,
I try really hard.
yeah. Yeah. And
It
that's
does weird things to your brain.
what we can do. Yeah. Oh, thank you so much for this conversation. It has
Same. I had
been
so
absolutely
much
good.
fun. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. I hope our listeners have. Was there, so you've given people like the question of what was the first story or thing that really hit you like magic was real, where you found, I mean, like I was taking that as where I found it resonating in something
Right.
else, right? Um,
You'll notice that both of us did not really follow the assignment.
no, no.
So feel free to not follow the assignment. It is intended only as a prompt for like inspiration and inquiry and experimentation and play.
Yeah, and also have a play with like have not play with an experiment with the bellow like a bull and then hiss like a snake, and let us know how you get on. Please, if you have any breathing conditions, heart conditions, tendency towards dizziness, anything like that, like you know your body, be sensible, make sure you're sat
Right.
down so that and you like take time to
Yeah,
recover.
and
You know, all of
clear,
the
like when you heard Halo and I do it, Halo and I both talk for a living.
yeah.
So like our ability to like maybe make those noises loud and for a long period might be bigger than yours. Like that's okay. Like do it until you run out of breath, not until you think you're supposed to run out of breath.
Yeah.
And similarly, if you're a singer, you're maybe going to be bellowing for a long fucking time,
Yeah. And
way
like
longer than
just pay attention to your body and make sure that you're not
exactly.
stood up and going to fall over if you get
Yeah.
too dizzy. Like I
And also like do it like if you're listening to this in a car while you're
yeah,
driving,
please
don't do
don't.
that. This exercise is designed to make you a little dizzy. Like do it somewhere where you can get dizzy.
Yeah. So all of those health uh, caveats, warnings, etc. Let us do our due diligence. Like, please be sensible, folks. You know yourselves. But have an experiment with it, and come and tell us in the comments of wherever you found this video, this podcast. Like,
I'm
how
going to
was that
assign
for
one
you?
more homework. Is that okay?
Yep. Yeah.
So now I want you to think about like the most like complex, sophisticated, like grown up nerd magic you do, and think about how you would teach a 5-year-old to do it
Mm.
and try doing it that way.
Can you give an example of sophisticated nerd magic? What you mean by that?
Yeah. So, say like a middle pillar exercise, which is both a specific Golden Dawn exercise and also like a category of exercises where you sort of light up internal energy centers, and those are correlated with certain divine names and yada yada, right? And like when I teach that to little kids, it's about like being a rainbow,
Yeah.
right? And so really think about like how to do that because I find it's one of the things I love about color magic, right? And like alphabet magic and number magic is it really like it forces you to really like whittle down what is the most important piece of this magic. So that's your homework. Take fancy, sophisticated, grown-up wizard magic and turn it into fairy tale magic and see how it goes.
Mm. And come and tell us. Come and
Yeah,
explain
please
it
do.
to me like I'm 6.
Exactly.
6-year-old Halo wants to learn the shit that you know.
Yeah, I'm very excited to learn everybody's
Yeah.
6-year-old magic, which is the best kind of. I mean, I love the weird nerd shit, and there is value in all that nerd shit. Like, you will find that your kid version, it's not the same. Like, you had to take out some important pieces and put in new pieces, but it's still going to be cool. It's going to be different. It
Yeah.
should be different. If it's the same, then maybe all your foo for all was nonsense and you didn't need it in the first place.
And on that note, Sarah, where can people come and find you? What is the next thing that you are teaching? Tell us about your next book that's coming out.
So this
What's the
is
next
not
thing?
going to be out until mid-March, true, because I have a bunch of live events, but I think they're all over by the time
This is
people
the
see
end of
this.
March.
Okay. So I am currently teaching always, like basically you can join anytime, Introduction to Witchcraft and the Planetary Pentacles of Solomon Magician King. Those are both like they're live courses. They have a lesson every month. They go in order, but you get all the back videos, not just from this year, but you get several years of videos. Though I would recommend, I think I get better usually. Like I think the third time I teach it is usually better than the first time I taught it. So I would watch the recent ones. But you get all the back videos plus all the invitations to like ongoing lessons. And I encourage people, even if you're not caught up, to just come to a live lesson if you can, right? Even if you're not caught up, and it'll be okay. Um, I by mid March. Oh, what else I'll have going on by mid March? But lots of cool stuff. I will say that my Introduction to Witchcraft class is becoming a book, which is currently with my editor. It will be out at Halloween, but actually, as of when we're taping this, which is January 23rd, pre orders for it just opened yesterday. So I'm super
Yay.
excited about it. By the time you guys are seeing it, you'll be able to pre order it like anywhere books are sold. The easiest way to find me on the internet is to put my name into Google with quotes around it. Like, I'm the only Sara Mastros in the world, I believe, because it's an uncommon Greek name written in English characters, right? So like if you put it in quotes, you will find me like my username everywhere, Facebook, Instagram, Blue Sky, whatever. It's always just going to be my name. So that's the easiest way to find me. Courses and everything are at witchlessons.com.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure there's some links down here.
There are links in the comments, in the caption. So I'm saying there are now when you're watching this. Absolutely. So
Feel
find
magic.
Sara Mastros. Her book Introduction to Witchcraft, which promises to be fascinating and includes lots of the whys and wherefores so that you can work out how to be a strategic witch, and not just flailing around like most of us had to do when we started, because all we could find was what was out in the 90s in the like bottom shelf of Waterstones or whatever you have over in the States, big bookshops. So find Sara Mastros, go and check out witchlessons.com, sign up to her newsletter to find out what events coming up. Tell us if you want us to do a howling for beginners. Tell us, and we will. And yeah.
And if you like this, please like and subscribe down there, wherever we are.
Yes.
So you get to see more of these conversations with Halen.
Yeah, thank you. That was the one that I'd forgotten. Like, subscribe, and share with a friend who you think might enjoy this conversation as well. Share around, and both of us would love to hear from you. The reason that we, the reason that we are out here, the reason that we're talking on podcasts, the reason that we post on social media, that we teach, is because we want to share magic, and we want to help you remember that the world is enchanted.
Amen.
Amen. Ooh.
Ooh.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much, Sarah. Check out all the links below. Share your homework, your experiences. And if you want to come and join me in the Enchanted Academy, it's a free community. We have monthly circles working with the fair folk and the fairies, exploring aspects of embodied witchcraft, and I run masterclasses each month on different topics. You can find the replays for the latest season in the Enchanted Academy, so head to my website, theenchantedacademy.com or halaquin.net for that. Check out all the links below. Come and see our stuff and talk to us, because we are here with you in order to bring magic to the world. Until next time, may your path always be full of beauty, delight, enchantment, and weird animal noises that take you into beautiful, beautiful trance.